Hello, welcome to Straightforward Levant TV with me, Khaled Khuwairi. This time, our discussion is quintessentially British, just like the imminent event, the general elections. It's a first in many ways this year. We will look at those firsts in their relation to Britain and its stance on in the Middle East, vis-à-vis what is going on in the Middle East and what affects Middle Eastern investors and immigrants here in the UK. I'd like to welcome our guest here at the studio with us in London, Mr. William Spring, British political commentator. Thank you very much for being on the show. And Mr. Omar Ismail from the constituency of Watford and of the Labour Party, of course. Before we get into our presumably heated discussion, let's have a look at this report on how the UK general elections affect the Middle East.
With numbers of young Britons fleeing to Syria, Arab investments in Britain heavily increasing, and voters taking to the polls in a week, foreign policy is a key factor for UK's party leaders. Military intervention, counter-terrorism strategies and refugees and immigration, though not central to party campaigns, are high on the agenda. In a speech at Chatham House last week, Labour leader Ed Miliband accused Prime Minister David Cameron and other world leaders of failing to stand by Libya, contributing in part to the crisis in the Mediterranean. Under the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition, British military assets have been used against the Gaddafi regime in Libya in 2011 and against Islamic State group targets in Iraq from last year. Labour backed the government in Commons votes approving the use of force in Libya and Iraq, but voted against the government motion supporting military action against the Assad government in Syria in 2013. The UK has donated £700 million in humanitarian aid to Syria, but has reluctantly only resettled 143 Syrian refugees. The Labour Party pressed David Cameron to accept 500 of the war-torn country's most vulnerable victims. In October 2014, Prime Minister David Cameron abstained on the symbolic vote to recognise Palestine as a state and professed his commitment to Israel's security and its right to defend its citizens. Labour leader Ed Miliband reportedly lost the support of Jewish donors after he criticised Israel's assault on Gaza. He has called on the blockade on Gaza to be lifted and expressed his support for a two-state solution.
I defend Israel's right to defend itself against rocket attacks. But I cannot explain, justify or defend the horrifying deaths of hundreds of Palestinians, including children and innocent civilians. And as a party, we oppose the further escalation of violence we have seen with Israel's invasion of Gaza. Because, friends, we've been here before and we know what happens next. More loss of life, more Palestinian suffering, more hatred, and more recruits to the ranks of terrorist groups like Hamas.
Since 2006, £4.4 billion have been spent by Middle Eastern families on property in London. Currently, 9 of the capital's largest development sites are controlled or owned by Arab investors, and the largest landowner in Mayfair, following the Duke of Westminster, is the Abu Dhabi royal family. Qatar's royal family also owns major stakes in some of London's landmarks, including the Shard, Harrods and Canary Wharf. With Britain's economy being top priority for all parties, foreign policy remains a key determinant, especially when it comes to the Muslim vote.
Mr. Spring, before we get into our discussion on the elections, tell us a little bit about Westminster. We always see the rows, which are not really a first in Westminster at the House of Commons. But what is different? You're a little bit older than I am. In your days, what's the difference in the style of those rows at Westminster?
Well, I think the older politicians had more chutzpah, as it were, you know. I mean, I always remember years and years ago hearing Lord Stockton, as he was, previously Harold Macmillan, make a speech. And he was saying to these young Tories, I'd happened to wander into this meeting at Hastings, and he was saying to them, you know, when I was Prime Minister, we used to say there was about 2% inflation, and there was 1% unemployment, and we had a word for this, and everybody waited for what was this word he was going to say, and he suddenly looked around at the audience and said, we used to say, you never had it so good. And everybody, the timing was exquisite. Now, these politicians of the older generation, they were orators as well as managers. I've been in the House of Commons and heard Michael Foot completely bring the House to a standstill, as it were, with his wit and power, cogency, eloquence. But there is nobody of that type there now. The last person really in that genre was Tony Benn, of course. Yeah. Now, mind you, I must say Jeremy Corbyn is brilliant as well. I don't want to...
We hosted him at some point here, actually.
Yes, of course. But what I'm saying is these older politicians did have a knowledge of history, a knowledge of how to make points in oratory, and yet the current breed, you know, I mean, we can have to say they don't seem to learn anything. They know nothing.
Mr Ismail, how would you comment on the style nowadays at the Commons?
I recall Wilson being my first Prime Minister in this country, you know, coming into this country and being involved in politics. He too had a magnificent wit as well as presence. I recall him, which absolutely floored me at the time, when he was asked, is it true, Mr Wilson, that when you're asked, when a politician is asked a question, they always answer with a question? And he said, who told you that? And he said it with such a straight face and, you know, sort of magnificent way, projection of his voice, and he had that presence with the pipe in his, I think the pipe in the corner of his mouth. I think when you look at the politicians nowadays, they all come from essentially one school. And they are being extremely managed. It has become a theatre. It's a director behind the scene that moves, literally, if you pardon the expression, it puppets. The politics has gone out of politics, if you know what I mean by that. There isn't that rich...
gravitas.
No, there is no rich discussion, there is no deep intellect anymore. As you quite rightly said, they don't seem to know anything.
So when it comes to the times and the pitch, for example, of Baroness Thatcher at the Commons, how could we compare, for example, nowadays Mr Miliband's speeches and rows with the current Prime Minister, David Cameron? We see a lot of, I mean, the other day people were saying it's a little bit too light.
Well, I think Miliband has made some good points, scored a few points in the last few weeks and months, in particular on the Middle East. I think it took a lot of courage for Miliband, with his ethnicity, to come out with his attack on the Jewish-Israeli position over Gaza.
You mean having Jewish parents?
Yes, yes.
He's Jewish.
Yes, of course.
His brother actually was in the Zionist movement as well, David Miliband.
Perhaps not, obviously, an Orthodox Jew, given he had a bacon sandwich. And now let's welcome someone from the UK Independence Party into our discussion. I'd like to welcome Mr Matt Davies from the constituency of Woking. Welcome to Straightforward Levant TV.
Hi there.
Mr Davies, while the UKIP is more focused on controlling immigration from within the EU, what is it that some individuals seem to portray the party as anti-Islamic?
Okay, so UKIP believe that one of the core tenets of being able to call yourself a nation is the ability to control your immigration and control your borders. Unfortunately, throughout the years, Labour and Conservative governments have given that right away, and the European Union, and effectively an unelected bunch of commissioners in the European Union, now make those border laws, plus a lot of other laws, that they really should not be, in our opinion. Now, on the anti-Islam piece, UKIP is not anti-Islam. If you look in the manifesto for UKIP, there is not a single anti-any group policy in there. Yes, there are pro-British policies in there, and we are unashamedly support putting the British people first. But Islam, we haven't got a problem with Islam. We haven't got a problem with any religion. What we do have a problem with, and this may be why the far left, the establishment and the EU forces attack us on this issue, is we speak the truth. And that means if there's a fascist element of any group, and let's be honest, there is a small percentage of Islam that does have that problem, just like most other groups have, then yes, UKIP will speak out loudly against that sort of element. And that's where our enemies, the people in the establishment and the hard left, they use that at every opportunity to try and paint us into being something we're not, thus to try and quell the support that is rising every single day here in Britain for UKIP.
Mr Omar Ismail here from the Labour Party in the constituency of Watford would like to interject.
Okay. Well, of course, I think Mr Davies seemed to forget what his leader has said about the Muslims being a fifth colonist. I'm proud of being a Muslim. I'm proud of being a British citizen that lived in this country perhaps longer than Mr Davies has been on this earth. I have contributed to life in Britain in many degrees. Mr Davies seemed to forget also that one of the comments that Mr Farage has made recently in a public speech, in a private speech, that it is not compatible being English and a Muslim. And I think, having heard what Mr Davies said, they probably have a selective memory of what his leader is saying.
Okay, can I come back on that?
Of course.
So you're absolutely painting Mr Farage to saying things that he's never actually said. When he talks about a fifth column, he doesn't mean all of Islam. He absolutely has never said that, and he absolutely means the small element that do want to change Britain to be an Islamic state. There are these people.
Where is your evidence of this? Where is your evidence that there is?
Go on to Google and do a search for Adam Chowdhury. Go and do a search for the ISIS marches in London. There's plenty of evidence. There is a small fascist element.
Small,
absolutely small.
Small.
I don't.
It's not the entire Muslim community in Britain, Mr Davies.
Of course not.
Woking should be proud.
Islamic.
Woking should be proud that it had the first mosque in Britain built well before you and I were born. Yeah. And there is a huge heritage, Islamic heritage in Britain that you and Mr Farage are ignorant of. Muslims in this country have contributed. Muslims in this country have contributed to the life of the whole country.
No one's
Muslims have fought for this country.
No one's arguing with that.
So for you and Mr Farage to come along and simply denounce a whole religion is unacceptable.
But Mr Ismail, 1 second, Mr Davies. Mr Ismail, like Mr Davies just said, it's a small, perhaps a minority within the Muslim British community that has the rhetoric of the likes of Anjem Chowdhury, the fascist mentality. But it takes only a few. We are against
those as well.
Yeah, but it takes only a few to cause havoc in the country.
Yeah, well, exactly. But Mr Farage also said it's not compatible being English and Muslim.
He didn't say that.
I know. I followed the news fairly closely, and I must say I've never heard Nigel Farage say that. I don't know where you get your basis.
Say what?
That it's incompatible to be a Muslim and English.
That was Mr Omar Ismail.
Yeah.
This is the problem with Labour. They are absolutely willing to tell lies to try and further their agenda. They will paint anyone as evil and nasty to try and promote their party, which actually bombed Muslim countries against the people's wishes. Let's not forget that. They actually killed thousands of Muslims, which UKIP was massively against. So it's really hard to take having someone from Labour preaching to us on a basis of lies.
Yes, and Mr Davies, on housing, the UKIP manifesto mentions bringing empty homes back to use in Britain. Now, under the current government, British people in the capital's prime locations are selling the properties because they're tempted by the good offers from foreign buyers, which ends up in a change of demographics, with many properties being vacant and the capital losing its authentic vibe. How is this going to affect British voters this time?
Okay, so this is a huge issue in Britain. People in this country have always had the right and the aspiration to own their own homes. Right now, because of the unlimited mass immigration that the EU has imposed on us, we have a net immigration flow of what's been reported as 300,000 per year. That has pushed up prices because these people have to live somewhere. And there's a massive need to, one, stop allowing mass immigration, thus cutting the demand, and two, then address the supply side as well. So UKIP has got a number of policies to do both. Obviously, getting control of our borders back will help us make sure we have reasonable levels of immigration, positive immigration like we've always had in Britain, and we actually do like and enjoy having new people come and give us their cultural input. What we also will do is we will stop people being able to buy homes from abroad when the schemes that they're buying them from are things like housing association sales and right to buy. Those schemes were for British people to own their own homes, not for people to make a fast buck. On top of that, one more thing, UKIP will also look at all of these empty properties that are in the country. There are a lot of empty properties where very rich, wealthy people from abroad have bought them up and are using them to just make money off of the insane house price inflation caused by mass immigration. Obviously, cutting the mass immigration will stop that massive inflation back to normal levels, but we will also have a situation where if homes are left empty for more than 2 years, then UKIP will look to, and it says this in the manifesto, will look to increasing the taxation on those. So people who are buying them simply to make a fast buck, it will become less of an incentive. Plus, we will use any money used from that to help build housing stock on brownfield sites so that British people once again can own homes.
Mr Davies, when it comes back to EU migration and the referendum that is almost promised by the current Prime Minister, should he win another term in government, do you think there will be a referendum under the current Conservative rule?
Now, unfortunately, the Conservatives have got a lot of form in this area. They lied us into the EU in the first place by telling us we wouldn't lose sovereignty, and that's absolutely happened. But successive Conservative governments have promised the referendums. They promised us one on Lisbon. He said he would not let it lie if the Lisbon Treaty went through, and he let it lie completely. Also, if we look at the state of this election, everybody knows there's not going to be a majority. The Conservatives have got absolutely no hope in hell of getting a majority. And Cameron is banking on that because he knows he will then not have to deliver a referendum because the Lib Dems or whoever he jumps into bed with will be a convenient excuse not to give a referendum. The guy's a fraud, basically, and if the British people aren't waking up to this by now, I don't know what it's going to take.
Mr Matt Davies, member of the UK Independence Party in the constituency of Woking, many thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot.
Mr Spring, let's talk about foreign intervention. Mr Miliband, hopeful for 10 Downing Street, keeps making it clear that he differs from New Labour's policy under former Prime Minister Tony Blair's policy in the Middle East and Libya. Do you think people are convinced that it's about the person, not the party per se?
No, I don't think people are convinced, because what happens, you get a disaster like the Iraq War, and now another disaster like the Libyan war, and British politicians have this amazing ability to extenuate themselves, absolve themselves of all responsibility for what's happened. It's perfectly correct that Blair was the instigator of the Iraq war, together with his press officer, Alistair what Campbell, I think, I've forgotten the name. Anyway, but he wouldn't have got that war through without the wholehearted support of, I'm afraid I have to say, a fascist group of Labour MPs in the House of Commons.
Still here today.
Who are still there, many of them, and whose records on voting were that they supported Blair's war on Iraq.
What's your take on that, Mr Ismail? They're still there.
I have a view, and I've never agreed with the Iraq War, and I actually one of those that demonstrated before the Iraq War. I think it was misconceived, it was misguided, and it was a wrong move by Tony Blair. But we mustn't really just blame the entire political party because Labour Party, because I recall that a number of really significant members of the cabinet at the time resigned on that issue. Cook has resigned, Claire Short resigned, and I remember those.
Gordon Brown didn't resign.
Well,
If he
Mr.
had
Gordon Brown
resigned,
didn't resign.
He would have brought the government down.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have.
Terrible mistake of his.
It was a mistake, and I think the party now have learned the lesson from what's happened. And as a result of that, and I think and I believe, as a result of that, learning that lesson, when it came to bombing Syria, the Labour Party in its entirety voted against bombing Syria. Albeit they probably went along with the Libyan issue because of the humanitarian side to it, that there was a huge threat from a tyrant, albeit he at the time was friend of the government as well. But Gaddafi actually represented a huge danger to his own people. It is sad that the government, Mr. David Cameron, did not continue supporting the Libyan. We wouldn't have seen what is happening now.
I do disagree with Ed Miliband on one point, and that is, he said the post-conflict planning over Libya is the reason why there's a mess in Libya. It is not the post-conflict planning, it was the conflict planning. There was absolutely no reason for the United Kingdom to go and attack Libya. Now, much as one agrees there were things that were wrong with the Libyan regime, as indeed with the Saddam Hussein's regime, there's also the doctrine of non-intervention, which we have failed to comply with.
Absolutely.
But this is when UKIP seems to be into a non-interventionist rhetoric.
Yes.
Let's welcome now our Skype guest, Mr. Sunni Hundal, journalist and lecturer at Kingston University. Welcome to our discussion today.
Hello.
Mr. Hundal, the Labour Party leader Ed Miliband suggests his foreign policy will make a difference in the Middle East, but he did differ from New Labour and Tony Blair. Tell us more, how would you see the difference?
Well, some of that has been touched upon by your other guests, but I think the difference is quite significant if you go into the details. Ed Miliband does not like war, he does not like confrontation, he much prefers debate, negotiation, and diplomacy. But there are obviously other people within the Labour Party who take a much hawkish view, and he's had to bring them over and keep them on side, while also keeping the non-interventionists in the Labour Party on side. It's been a tricky balancing act for the Labour leader because his main aim within the party has been to keep it together without letting the party collapse into massive civil war. So, I mean, you know, the intervention in Libya is an example where he criticized the Prime Minister for not doing better to protect the people of Libya after the intervention, and also stopped the intervention into Syria because of worries that wasn't properly thought out and it was going to make things worse. So he doesn't have, you know, unlike Tony Blair, he doesn't have a view which is we should always intervene or we should always do this, we should always do that. He's very much of the view that we have to take each situation as it comes. We have to think carefully about whether it affects people, whether it helps them or not, whether the situation will be improved or not. And notably, he took a very different view from different Labour leaders in the past by not only saying that the Labour Party will recognise Palestine, but also criticised Israel quite strongly during its incursions into Gaza last time. So, you know, that he's taken a very different view from the Labour leadership in the past.
But this has caused, as you just said, Mr. Hundal, a little bit of varied opinion within the Labour Party, which needs, like you said, keeping together. But then again, there's someone here with his Labour Party, including different and varied, maybe perhaps contrasting views, and then he's a hopeful to be the Prime Minister. Now, assuming he won the elections, how cohesive will the Labour Party stay over his policies? Because we do know very well, especially over the state of Palestine, many Labour MPs were not, didn't really share the same views of Mr. Miliband.
Yeah, it's always a difficult balancing act because the Labour Party and, in fact, even the Conservative Party are broad churches. You know, I went to a Islamic Relief dinner where Alan Duncan MP, who was previously a minister within the Conservative government, said that he thought his party was wrong and it should have recognised Palestine. So the fact of the matter is both parties have different elements, different people who will have different views, and that's one of the great things about democracy. The Labour leader will have a significant challenge from people who think that they should not recognise Palestine or do more to recognise Palestine further and should not criticise Israel. But I think we now have an opportunity to push him further on this issue like never before.
Yes.
And also make the argument and he's open to those arguments.
Yes, and speaking of keeping the party together, do you think Mr. Miliband, would you think he has the leadership factor to keep the party together eventually?
Yeah, I think people underestimate actually how strong he has been within the party and keeping things together. He's not only made a big change from the past in terms of foreign policy, but also in terms of political economy, and saying that New Labour made a lot of mistakes in the way it regulated the banks and the way it dealt with the economy. It's also changed policy quite significantly in other areas too. Immigration is another example. Europe is another example. Yes. So, and he's all this time managed to hold together a party which has quite significantly different people with different views. And I think people underestimate him because they think that he's a weak leader, but he's not. Within the party, he has managed to carry people together.
Yes.
And take them into a new direction.
Yes, and speaking of the EU, how would you assess Mr. Miliband's last week at Chatham House, linking Mr. Cameron's government policy in Libya to the recent tragedy in the Mediterranean migrant boats, the migrants trying to come to the EU?
I think he was absolutely right to say what he said, and despite the controversy, I think he should have gone further. I absolutely blame David Cameron.
Further to where? Would you want to elaborate?
As in, you know, he did not specifically criticize Cameron. He did not blame Cameron for the deaths in the Mediterranean.
Did you want him to?
Yes.
I would have wanted him to, yes.
There's Mr. Spring here saying the same thing. Tell us, Mr. Spring, why would you have wanted him to be so forward when it comes to this accusation? It's a serious accusation.
Yeah, this is where Miliband was padding his words a bit, pulling his punches. The facts are that it was not the post-conflict planning that has led to these disasters in the Mediterranean. It is the conflict itself. And David Miliband...
Yes.
David Miliband must take 100% responsibility for every person who has died in the Mediterranean, because under Gaddafi...
Why not any other leader from the EU?
Because...
Why is it Mr. Cameron?
Cameron created the war on Libya. He was the one who pushed with Sarkozy for the RAF to bomb Libya from a great height. So none of our chaps got killed. So that's a good war from the British point of view. The facts are, though, thousands of extremely brave Libyans died, and also there was a lot of collateral damage. And then after that, the British went into Libya itself. The so-called freedom fighters, or whoever they were called, they were assisted by British and French special forces that went into Tripoli. They were even giving orders in English, go to the right, go to the left. And with the final lynching of Gaddafi, the SAS was very much involved.
And back to you, Mr. Hundal, you seem to be very critical of recent articles in the media. I must say there is some tension escalating in the language many media outlets of the right wing are using. How would you explain that on some occasion you even describe it as neo-Nazism?
Well, I mean, I suppose you mean the articles by Katie Hopkins, which I described as using neo-Nazi language. You know, I think that there is, it's worrying that we are seeing an escalation in rhetoric in the UK and blaming people in the Mediterranean for their own deaths, and also calling them these names. I mean, Katie Hopkins is one. Thankfully, she's been the only one who's gone that far. And I think that the significant backlash to her shows that most British people do not approve of such language. So, you know, it's worrying, obviously, but I have faith in the British people, and I think that most of them would not use such language. And I think that when I saw, and I've heard even news programs that she's been on and radio programs where she's been on, she's had a lot of criticism from people.
Yes.
And
but then again, sorry to interrupt, Mr. Hundal, you say that the Mr. Miliband should have gone further over the migrant boats, but don't you think it's a little bit desperate to use those innocent souls who were trying to get into the EU as a weapon to mobilize voters when it comes to blaming the Conservative Party and Mr. Cameron particularly? How do you think about the timing and sort of almost abusing this politically to get into more people into the ballots voting Labour?
Well, the timing point is a bit irrelevant because Mr. Miliband had to make a big speech on foreign policy before the election. We had to know where he stood on foreign policy and what his vision was. And that was right to do so. I wish he'd done it earlier, but he had to do it sooner or later. By the Mediterranean deaths, actually, I'm glad that he made that point, because someone had to raise on a bigger level that these people were dying as a result of policy which was partly driven by Europe. And we have to take responsibility for that. And Cameron had to take responsibility for his own actions. And I'm glad that he made that point. Otherwise, if he hadn't made that point, then lots of people would have criticized him for saying nothing over the Mediterranean deaths and not taking Cameron to task for what he did.
You just mentioned because of policies drafted by Europe, but then again the Labour Party seems not to challenge Europe very much. Anyway, so Mr. Sunny Hundal, author of India Dishonoured, also runs Liberal Conspiracy, one of the UK's top 3 most influential left-of-centre politics blogs. Many thanks for your participation today. Mr. Ismail, I see.
It is a very important point to make here. Having heard all that, and I totally agree with most of what your Skype guest said. And the point is that with Cameron and Sarkozy bombing Libya at that time, it was not just done with the agreement between the European countries and America as well in the background, but also by a number of Arab countries, including Egypt and the Arab League as well. And I recall that the General Secretary, the Secretary General of the Arab League, asking for intervention in Libya at that time. So we can't totally put the blame on the British going there. What I agree with Ed Miliband totally in that there was lack of a planning to what happens after the bombing, after getting rid of Gaddafi.
Why did your Labour Party not bring this planning into Westminster so as to prevent this whole byproduct of what happened there?
I think there was a lesson learned from that. If you, as an observer, you probably would see that and learn the lesson that the intervention in Libya created unacceptable situation in Libya itself, which we see it now being unfolding in front of us. And that is one of the reasons that when the issue of Syria came for voting, Labour Party voted against bombing Syria, because the party in Parliament have seen
And that was a first.
The result of the lack of planning for what happens afterwards. One other issue that is very curious, and it has to be mentioned here, that as a result of what the Labour Party did inside Parliament, by defeating the motion, that too have changed the American foreign policy towards Syria, because they went again. They were ready to go.
Yes.
Until that vote was defeated, that motion was defeated, and Obama had to go to his Congress to approve it, and it was defeated in Congress as well. So that is resulted, as a result of the courageous point that, or the courageous stance that Ed Miliband have made, it changed the politics, the American foreign policy as well, in my view.
Mr. Ismail, let's touch a little bit on political Islam in the UK.
Sure.
Now, amongst what is known as the Muslim vote, to what extent is it true that the Muslim vote tends to go for Labour?
I wouldn't say that the entire Muslim vote goes for Labour. This is not true. There are Muslims who support the Conservative. We've seen a number of them. There was a very prominent Muslim woman in the Conservative government. Warsi, I think her name is she's titled, isn't she? Is she a lady, isn't she a lady? Yeah. And there are a number of Muslims in the Lords who are Conservative. Equally, there are liberal. In fact, I know of a few liberals that almost succeeded in getting safe seats near where I live, but they was just unlucky. But there are Muslims who would support different parties, and we've seen also maybe one or two who are misguided, in my view, joining UKIP.
We respect all views, of course. Mr. Spring, last summer the ISIS flag was flown on a residential estate in East London. How could this happen under a Conservative Party? Or would this have been a byproduct of policies of the previous Labour governments?
Well, anybody can fly a flag from their private home, I would imagine. I don't think there's any law in England saying you mustn't fly a flag.
What about the flyers handed out to teenagers to go and join ISIS in Oxford Circus in London?
Well, that's more dubious. If you're encouraging people to go and fight in a foreign war, that may be a contravention of the current domestic law here.
But could we link this to policies of either the Labour government or the current government?
Yes, I do think we should link
and
it.
How would you treat that, basically? There is a phenomenon where people are so pro-ISIS here within the Muslim youth in England. How would you handle that?
I would say that they should turn the page. The trouble is they are on a page, on the earlier page. You remember the British government, as you were talking about the bombing of Syria, the proposed bombing, the British government was demonising Assad and encouraging, by implication, these young people to go to Syria, because they thought, oh, we're co-belligerents. The British are going to be bombing, we can be on the ground. Now, they don't follow the changes of parliamentary voting and so on, and they've still carried on with their same position.
Not anymore, now that security is at stakes here. Obviously, we've seen Mrs. Theresa May draw the line there when it comes to people going to fight.
Well, they should have drawn the line earlier. They should surely have seen that problem earlier, not just now.
I think really there is now, and I can just quote this, there is now an effort to engage, and it is a lack of engagement with with young people, particularly Muslim young people, where the whole environment had been left vacuous from a meaningful engagement by the British government, by the authorities, by different establishment within Britain. In the last 3-4 weeks, I've attended a meeting with Westminster Council in regards of trying to do something in terms of preventing our young people being misguided.
Right.
A number of solutions which now are going to be considered after the election, and how to engage with these young people. It's not just about it's not about funding and just some money and go away. It has to be a full engagement in many levels.
And now we are joined by Mr. Joseph Willits at the Council for Arab-British Understanding here in London. Welcome to our discussion.
Thank you very much.
Joseph, let's start from a recent article you wrote on the UK Independence Party and Islam. You say, quote, "To say that some views of UKIP candidates are merely Islamophobic is an injustice to the seriousness of some of the comments, which can only be termed as anti-Muslim hate." Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I wrote a blog documenting the views of election candidates, local candidates from 2014, and many others from UKIP who have offered their anti-Muslim, anti-Islam views, and some of them are pretty frightening. I mean, there are some UKIP candidates that are standing across the country that call Islam a cult, that call for Muslims to be deported, mosques to be banned. Gerard Batten, for example, who is an MEP in London and is standing in Romford, said that Muslims should sign a charter, a declaration renouncing terrorism. And this kind of rhetoric is all over the place when it comes to UKIP, and UKIP keep playing the victim card at the moment, saying that we're tired of these racist slurs. Well, actually, many people across the country are tired of this kind of rhetoric, particularly about Islam, and I think Muslims are seen as fair game by UKIP, and tired of hearing this kind of hatred, and it has to stop. I mean, there are plenty on a local level, on a more national level. There is a lot of rhetoric from UKIP, which is just awful at the moment.
Excuse me.
There's Mr. Spring here. I would like to interject.
You say it has to stop. Why don't you tell that to the terrorists who are executing Christians on the beach in Libya, Coptic Christians? Why don't you say something to the fascist element of the ISIS movement, who are engaged in massive...
We are continually condemning ISIS.
Well, you haven't done today. You're condemning UKIP, who are simply making...
You have just made a link, sir, between Muslims and ISIS, and in the same way that UKIP are doing, linking every action of Muslims to ISIS. I mean, in fairness, most of the victims of ISIS are Muslims themselves. So, I mean, may I put that question to you?
I'm afraid a large number of victims of ISIS are Arab Christians.
Yes, they are also Arab Muslims.
And Arab Muslims, I agree, but the Arab Christians are being extirpated purely and simply on account of their faith, not for any political reason.
You believe that UKIP have a right to attack and target Muslims?
No,
in this country, in this election. Do you believe that, judged on that, you think that Muslims are fair game?
No. Number one, I disagree with your statement that UKIP is targeting Muslims. It is not. What UKIP and other parties have attacked is an element in Islam.
Well,
the Takfiris.
I would like you, if you could read what I've the statements that I have put out on my blog, which is it's available. I would be very happy to send it over to you, and you will see that this is not just targeting Muslims that are, somehow targeting terrorism or radicals or anything like that. This is targeting a general population, and there are endless comments that target Muslims in general, call for banning of Islam, banning of mosques. Not just this link with ISIS, which you are somehow suggesting. It is across the board. And should all of our Muslim friends have to sign a charter renouncing terrorism? Are they responsible for that? I don't think they are.
I would disagree with you on that, on a number of points of what you've said, because I've lived in a country which was 100% ideologically Islamic, and Christians were not allowed even to live there. They were certainly not allowed to practice their faith, and this is a country that we are tied up with. Britain is tied up with.
You're talking about
Saudi Arabia. It's a one-party state with a complete intolerance of any minorities.
Mr. Willits, how important is the state of Palestine when it comes to the Muslim vote and on this occasion? And tell us a little bit about that.
Obviously, Palestine has always been a really important issue for the Muslim community. But it's not just, I think it would be unfair to say that this is just a purely Muslim issue. What we've seen is across the board now, there is an anger, I guess, at the injustice in Palestine. And there's also a huge desire from across the board from people of often all political persuasions to actually recognise Palestine.
But how does the Labour Party look nowadays when in October last year its leader, Mr Miliband, demanded a whipped vote over recognising Palestine as a state?
Well, in terms of Palestinian recognition, it wasn't a binding vote. But it was fantastic to see so many MPs, and also not just from the Labour Party, but voting in favour of the principle of recognition. And he has said, and this has gone down well in many circles, and it hasn't necessarily in others. But he has said that we are going to look into the recognition of Palestine, and I hope that the Labour Party sticks to its word and says that we will recognise Palestine if he were to become Prime Minister.
But that very Labour Party, Mr Willits, many MPs were embarrassed on that occasion, and perhaps, as you know, the style of Mr Miliband to whip the vote was a little bit frowned upon at the time. So
it was a free vote. It was not whipped vote. It was a free vote for an entire House. It wasn't whipped, I don't think. And
he wanted it to be whipped.
I think really when we recall this event is an event that the British democracy should be absolutely not only aware of what's happening in the House of Commons, but to be proud of it, because here we are, a Jewish man that suffered under his parents suffered under the Nazis, recognized the painful experience that the Gazian and the Palestinians are suffering from different attacks in different parts of Gaza and elsewhere in Palestine. And he stood up and declared his, not allegiance, but his political, actually he hung his political future, because now he's become a pariah to a number of Jewish institutions in this country who are now do not want to see him as a prime minister of this country, and are working against him. But the man stood up and was counted as one of those people that want to see a peaceful Middle East through a two-state solution to Palestine and the right of Israel to exist.
Even though he may have upset, like you said, the Jewish community, which will have a say at the ballots.
I will tell you something. His uncle actually lives next door to me in Watford. And they were totally supporting him for what he's done. So this is a man that has suffered, and his family suffered from discrimination and suffered from horrendous pain that they had to go through to escape from Germany to come to this country. He has recognized that, he's doing something about it, and he should be commended for it.
Joseph Willits, you've been around refugee camps in the Middle East recently with delegations from Westminster. Do you think there is a possibility that Britain will be taking more refugees should Labour win or not in the coming year?
As an organisation, we make actually we think they're incredibly vital. Our delegations we do delegations to Palestine, to Jordan, to Lebanon, and I visited Jordan and Zatari camp in November, and I visited Lebanon in last month. The government's record, I think, in allowing resettling 143 refugees is shameful, and I think across the country, many Brits, including myself, are appalled by this record. The Labour Party has said, and I hope that if it does come into power, that it will continue with this. It has said that it will join the UN resettlement scheme. This may, we're not talking about thousands and thousands of refugees coming to this country, but there should be more than 143. The government is, there will be more than 143 when it comes to the end of this, but the numbers are just too small.
How about there's 1 million out of 4 million Lebanese people, there's another 1 million from Syria. So on the scale of Britain, that would be 15 million coming here, and you only had 143, did you say? So
1.3 million in Lebanon. There's 3.8 million more now that overall Syrian refugees overall. And I think, but what is really damaging at the moment is this really vicious climate, and we've seen it. The guest in interjecting before kind of embodies that a little bit. Is that this vicious climate when it comes to the dehumanization of people? Even the word migrant is a dehumanizing term. And refugees, and we keep treating people as if. Firstly, they're idiots, and that we should not do anything. And I mean, the lack of compassion in this country at the moment seems to be really tepid. And political parties and UKIP are the biggest proponents of this kind of idea that the lack of compassion, the encouraging lack of compassion, particularly when it comes to Muslim refugees. I mean, this idea from Nigel Farage that only let the Christians in. There was a UKIP candidate that said, send the Muslims to Saudi Arabia.
But that could have been influenced, perhaps, Joseph, by the sentiment in the Middle East. Perhaps that's some sympathy towards other minorities that are being oppressed, like Mr. Spring was saying, in the Middle East, which you just visited recently. Anyway, Joseph Willits at the Council for Arab-British Understanding, previously deputy editor at the political website Conservative Home. Many thanks for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
Omar Ismail, Mr. Ismail, looking at the Labour manifesto when it comes to housing, we do know that this is an area of interest for Arab investors as well, especially in London. They own a lot of prime locations in London nowadays. Don't you find it a little bit risky when it comes to those investors, perhaps when it comes to the Labour mansion tax, bedroom tax and all that sort of thing?
I don't think imposing mansion tax on properties of £2 million and above will affect those Arab investors, as you call them. They're mostly absent anyway.
But why would they have to pay more? They could go to Paris.
Well, they can go to Paris. At least they will release some stock. Now, a huge number of people who actually serve London, the taxi driver, the train driver, the cleaner, the hospital cleaner, the hospital staff cannot get housing within the London area because of the increase in prices. They cannot buy their own house because of the price of their properties that have jumped so much over the past years. It has become totally impossible to live in London for those communities. So let's just separate the two things, because the two things have no connection whatsoever. The people that live in this country, that produce and help to produce the wealth for this country, it's not just the money that's coming in from abroad, but the people that live in this country that make it what it is.
But the money coming will promote growth, especially commercial investments. It's not always residential.
But I agree with you. I agree with you. But what we're talking about in terms of housing is the ability to provide the opportunity for those who are working hard in this country to have a decent home with a reasonable rent. It is unacceptable now that you know, my son, for example, would not be able to buy a house in London. So he has to travel outside London, maybe 30, 40 miles, to buy a house with a reasonable price. When I came into this country, a 5-bedroom house was £4,500, right? And I was earning, when I applied for a mortgage, I got the mortgage, which was about 3 times of my earning at that time.
You definitely don't look that old.
When you compare it to the price now in terms of earnings, you need to be earning 10 times to be able to buy a property in London. This is because of what's happening, of money coming from abroad, and it's not just the Middle East.
No, of course.
It is also the Russian oil money that flooding Chelsea
and China.
And China as well. You know, so the party has to look to the people of the country who produce the wealth for this country. This money that comes in does not produce anything. It is a service economy. So, and we need to provide housing, and I'm sure even all the parties have agreed on that in different format. We need to provide the housing for the ordinary men and women in this country.
Mr. Spring, to what extent is foreign policy a matter that is influenced by the Prime Minister and the ruling party? And do you think Mr. Miliband was right not mentioning the US in his recent speech as often as he did with the EU? Can you really isolate Britain from the US, which is a major player in the global politics?
Well, I don't think that you can isolate Britain from the EU or from the US. Both artifacts, or both countries, both confederations. Britain is in a special relationship, so-called, with Washington. Doesn't like to fall out with the Americans, but the Americans in turn have to be agreeable and rational. Unfortunately, the American foreign policy since Vietnam and before has been considerably irrational. And that is why the Americans cannot expect Europe to continue backing them, and particularly Britain. I mean, we all, you know, I'm a generation where I like Ike, you know. Without the Americans, we wouldn't have had Western Europe liberated. And, but at the same time, without the Russians, I would probably be speaking German now, because the Russians took the majority of the casualties in World War II.
Well, there you go. So you don't definitely want too much EU influence over the UK.
No.
I guess we'd have to leave it there for this evening. Only time, and only the 7th of May will determine who will be the next Prime Minister of Britain, with voters from the Levant having a say at the ballots. We do hope this episode helps undecided individuals choose on the day. I'd like to thank our guests who joined us today: Matt Davies of the UKIP party in Woking, Sunni Hundal, journalist and lecturer, spoke to us from London, and Mr. Joseph Willits, Parliamentary Officer at the Council for Arab-British Understanding, and of course our studio guests here, Mr. Omar Ismail of the Labour Party in Watford, and Mr. William Spring, British commentator and political analyst. Thank you very much for being on the show. Stay tuned to Straightforward Levant TV, and I'll be with you again soon. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.